Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Code and Pixels. I'm Kelly Harrop.
Hello, my name is Adekunle, and we have a special guest today. Jack, want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Jack, I work on design system stuff over at Amplitude Analytics.
So, in today's episode, we're going to be going over components, and we're so excited to have Jack join us. And, Jack, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at Amplitude, how you ended up there, and tell us about yourself.
Sure. So I joined Amplitude about 2.5 years ago, initially as an IC product engineer, but pretty soon after I got there, I realized that the component library that a couple of my predecessors had built up didn't have a strong steward in the company anymore. And since I've been building component-driven architectures for a while and pretty involved in front-end infrastructure, I became the de facto person to take that over. It went well, and I started building a team around it. Now I head up the design system and parts of the front-end infrastructure at Amplitude.
You said you had a lot of experience building up infrastructure. How did you get started in that?
Yeah, so when I was first getting into tech, I got into tech in earnest in maybe 2014, and I was basically building front ends with jQuery at the time. But a company that I had co-founded got into Y Combinator, and the first engineer that we hired was really into React. He started at the company just a couple of weeks after I did, so he was practically a co-founder too, and he was really excited about this hot new thing called React. This was the summer of 2015, and took the time to kind of walk me through it, build some stuff with it. We obviously were spending 8, 10, 12 hours a day hacking over the summer, because that's what you do in an accelerator program. And by the time the summer wrapped up, the company ended up not going anywhere, but it really seeded the ground for my passion about React specifically at the time, but just functional front end, so component-driven architectures in general. And everything else that kind of like has come in my design systems career since then has really can be traced back to the idea of taking small things and composing them into bigger things. And it was React that really unlocked it for me.
Cool, cool, cool.
Awesome. We're both React fans over here.
Yeah, I could say that I am a big fan of React. I try other frameworks, and I'm like, ugh. But it might be just like I don't want to learn new things. So
I
that
think that there are some really interesting, promising other frameworks, especially ones like Svelte and Vue that move more of what's happening to compile time. Even in the React community, I'm a big fan of zero runtime CSS and JS frameworks like Vanilla Extract and Stitches that sort of take things that have been done at runtime and move them to build time. And if there's, I'm still very much like in the weeds of React every day, but I definitely view the future as more stuff moving to compile time, whether it's through changes in React or different frameworks getting.
interesting. I'm wondering like specific thoughts or your opinions on like CSS frameworks. See, we have like different ways to write. So Sass, some people do inline CSS, some people do
Yep.
Tailwind. I'm just wondering what's your opinion about that?
Oh gosh, I've got a ton of opinions, and I feel like there's not a single right answer. Like, I think that a lot of these things boil down to what works best for your project, what you like the best, and what works best for your team. And if you're doing something that it's just you, what you like the best is what works for your team. If you're doing something inside of a company, oftentimes those are different things. And I think a lot of like arguments over what the right answer is boils down to like what works for a team, even if it isn't your own personal preference. But I've been a big fan. I guess for me, the first like distinction that started to make was, are you writing that gets applied to documents? So like classic CSS, where you have a static document and you're applying styling to it? Or are you building components that have styling baked in, and like decisions of which frameworks you might use and how you might architect your CSS is going to be very different based on whether you're building a multi-page website or a web app. And I've been building web apps for the past 7 or 8 years, and having styling baked into the component as opposed to something that's applied externally has always been super attractive to me. It was attractive to me when, back in the early days of Radium, which is one of the early CSS in JS frameworks that was terribly unperformant, but I thought unlocked a new way of thinking about component styling. It was true when styled components took the world by storm, and that was really the first CSS and JS framework that I started to nerd out about deeply. And then when the kind of like issues that styled components and emotion started to uncover, which was basically like the fact that you can, with those frameworks, get a much better developer experience. And in some cases, because you're shipping only the critical CSS, only the CSS that that part of your web app needs, you can get a better user experience too, but it's at the cost of a runtime penalty. And that runtime penalty for some sites doesn't matter at all. For some sites, the trade-off is clearly worth it, but why pay a penalty if you don't have to? And that's when I started to get excited about frameworks like Vanilla Extract, which is what I use today, and Stitches, which is like another one that is architecturally and philosophically pretty similar, that provide a lot of the same ergonomics of runtime CSS and JS frameworks without the runtime penalty.
Every time you say Vanilla Extract, I want cupcakes.
It's funny. One of the cool things that they do is they do have a framework for some runtime styling that you can run with Vanilla Extract or not. But the way that they separate it so that you're only making conscious decisions about whether you want to introduce runtime overhead or not is Vanilla Extract is the 0 runtime framework, and the framework that does have some runtime penalty that you can use alongside of it for some better ergonomics is called Sprinkle.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, working in design systems and managing a team, what is your philosophy on designer and developer collaboration? Like, how do you see that manifest both like in roles, but also in terms of practice and shipping new features and components?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any one answer to that and any one sort of philosophy. Like, at the end of the day, if you're shipping high quality stuff from a design perspective and also from an execution perspective, then whatever process is causing you to do that, do more of that. And if you're not, figure out why not and fix it. I think that one of the things that I always think about in this regard is ownership. And regardless of how the team is structured, regardless of whether it's designers and developers with a handoff in between, or designers and developers working super collaboratively together, that's how it looks at Amplitude right now, or designers who code, which is definitely something that like some other companies have leaned heavily into. However it's organized, I feel like designers need to care about the execution of their work, and engineers need to care about design. So like the kind of hot button question that always starts a flame war on Twitter every couple of months, which is, should designers code? I think the answer to that is maybe not, it doesn't matter, but do designers need to take personal ownership of what ships? Yeah, and one way to take ownership of that is be the person shipping it, code. Another way to take ownership of that is really build up awesome relationships with the engineers who are shipping it, and do it by owning more of the process and more of the back and forth. There's enough things that are really important that go into building a good design system from a design perspective, from a process perspective, from an engineering perspective, that no one person is going to own all of those skill sets on a team. But it's super, super important for everyone on the team to really value all of those skill sets and care about them deeply and take complete ownership over the sort of like, I don't know, full quality of what ships. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because one of the things on it when I was like being a graphic designer, we actually went to a printing press to understand like the medium, and that's what I kind of compared to stuff we do, where it's like be able to understand medium to be able to make the best decisions possible. So I always tell people, like, even if you're gonna like be a coder, just understanding the limitations and what works, what doesn't work is always a good way to kind of be advocate for designers, but also be super helpful for the engineering partners. So the next question we have, and again, this is a hot topic, but just from what do you think design system teams get wrong? And this could be anything from process or just kind of like building components and whatnot. But I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that first of all, design systems teams, including the one I'm on, we get a lot of things wrong. And I think that is one of the exciting things about being someone who's working on design systems right now is it's a new space. It's a space that only was taken seriously in a couple of like innovative Silicon Valley tech companies up until very recently. So the idea that every company wants a design system, wants to be building in this way, that wasn't true even just a couple of years ago. So the fact that like people are around a little bit and trying to figure it out, that is natural and part of the reason why our work is so exciting. I think one of the biggest things that a lot of places get wrong about design systems is they over-index on the word design and they under-index on the word system. And like the way that I've always framed it at Amplitude is that like the purpose of a design system is less about doing design work, or at least the way that we're structured. I'll put a pin in that and come back to it because there are other design systems that work really well in a different setup. But at Amplitude, like design system work is less about doing design work and more about scaling good design work. So it's about facilitating the right questions, giving the right feedback, building in the right way so that the wider design org, when they make design decisions or when they have ideas for design experiments or when they want to change the look and feel of a part of our app, they have the tools in place to do that really safely in a high quality way without as heavy of a lift as what a full redesign would be. And that's a hard thing to do, but it requires you to build in a way that prioritizes iteration as like a first class citizen. And that's where I think a lot of design systems don't put enough thought and enough of their rigor. Just to come back to the point that I made at the beginning, I don't think that's necessarily the right approach for every single design system. I think that is the right approach for design systems that are working on products where iteration matters. If you were to be working like on a publication or a website, if you were working on williamsonoma.com or the New York Times or something like that, I can imagine there that brand consistency is the most important thing. And there you might want to more tightly couple the design itself to the design system. And so I don't think that it's always wrong to couple design and systems work, but at Amplitude, for the product work that we do, we think it's important to view ourselves less as a kind of doer of design and more as a platform for design.
Yeah, I really like that framing as a platform because depending on what you're trying to do, design systems, it can be considered sometimes a product, sometimes a service, platform, infrastructure. And I think there's different use cases depending on what you're trying to ship and measure. And yep. I know with design systems, it can be tricky because some folks might think of contribution as a goal. Some might think adoption is a goal. And so measuring success can look very different from one team to another. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on contribution? Do you swing more into one direction over the other? Or?
That's a great question. I think that a lot of the metrics like contribution, like adoption, other sort of things that we view as important that I'll get into, a lot of those things, the best way to think about them are not as like goals in and of themselves, but as numbers that you would expect to move in a certain direction if the work that you're doing is impactful and the right thing. So like we focused pretty heavily on in that like we have built some internal tools and do about maybe 30 minutes of manual work to each week to measure our adoption, and that's the number that we look at, not because we think that adoption in and of itself is super valuable, but because we think that it is a really good indicator that the things that we're building are getting used and that the behaviors that we're trying to encourage in our product teams of reaching for systems components as opposed to building things ad hoc are happening. The answer is not to say, oh, adoption went from 48% to 48.3%, let's celebrate, or it went from 48% to 47.8%, let's panic. It's to understand those movements and why they happened, because, like, generally speaking, we would expect those numbers to drive up until a point if we're doing good work. So if we're not seeing that, we want to understand why we're not seeing that so we can figure out, is it that we're not doing good work? Is it that we're building the wrong things? Is it that we're not doing enough on the education front to let people know what exists? Or is it something that is totally benign and okay, like people, like we're building more complex components, so people are replacing 6 inputs and a button for a form component, and like that is going to drop adoption if you're measuring it naively, but also be a good thing. So all of those metrics, they don't correlate with like goals for us. They correlate with things that we believe would move in a certain direction if we're doing good work. Other things that we measure the sort of ongoing usage of components that we're trying to deprecate. We measure indicators of code quality, like lint overrides, specifically lint overrides around any. We use TypeScript, so around any types. So we try and like make sure that we're creating a good backstop for type soundness. Things like code complexity is another thing that, again, it's not a goal in itself, but it's a pretty good indicator, or at least one indicator of code health and how easy code is to iterate on. Third-party dependency management is another thing that we own and keep a close eye on, because again, you're not going to move any business metrics by upgrading from React 17 to React 18, but if you're not doing that, it allows rot to take hold. It's almost like owning a boat and not spraying it down and cleaning it up each time after you use it. And sometimes you don't want to. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to. Sometimes there's a pressing business issue that you need to take care of first, but you want to make sure that you're making those decisions deliberately and you're not letting the wrong behaviors take hold. So we're very metrics driven. That's a long way of saying that we're very metrics driven, not because we think that they're the only thing that matter, but because we think that if we're doing the right things, they'll show up in the metrics.
Yeah, I like the metaphor of Russ, but sometimes you just want to like sink the boat and build a new one.
Absolutely, yeah.
But one question I got just from talking about, because you were talking about a lot about metrics and whatnot. So I'm wondering, how do you even validate like the well-being of your design system and components?
Yeah, it's obviously through like 3 main things. One of them is, are people using the components that are being built? One of them is just asking them, making sure that we're having conversations all of the time with the engineers and designers on product teams who are using it, saying, what do you like about this? What sucks about this? What can we be, like, what's frustrating and what's awesome, with a focus on what's frustrating, and then trying to turn some of that like qualitative feedback into metrics that we can pay attention to. May, who's on my team and I work really closely with, she put together a Amplitude integration for Storybook recently. So like we have all of our components and documentation in Storybook. We can now use Amplitude to figure out how the other engineers and designers on our team are using Storybook to access and play with the components there. NPS scores, so quarterly surveys that we ask the same questions quarter after quarter and try and get like qualitative feedback and turn it into data to see what the general kind of like feeling is. Because like sometimes when you're having just conversations, the conversations that are easiest to anchor on are the loudest conversations, the ones with people who either have problems and are frustrated by those problems, or who are evangelists and really enjoy what you're working on and what you're doing and totally bought in. But we try and capture as much of the middle proactively, but also through surveys.
That's really great that y'all are engaging with your community, and it sounds to me like everyone's invested in going out and understanding how your users are using components from your design system. And you mentioned like May's awesome Storybook integration, which I'm sure we'll link in the show notes.
I forgot to say, I should have said that's open source.
It's open source. Awesome. I wanted to ask, what do you think is like the main like blocker or Timesink when it comes to shipping components?
Oh gosh, there are so many. I don't think that there's just one. I will say that there are a couple of like obvious ones that I think some of the people that are listening to this are already thinking about. So like one of them is quality is hard, and getting things right requires sometimes more work than would seem intuitive, and in a lot of cases more work than even seems reasonable. So I don't think that should be not talked about. It's really hard to build a good drop down. It's really hard to build a good button. When you get into more complex components like charts and tables and things like that, there are entire companies that like that's what they do. So if there's a company that can make money doing it, that is a pretty good indicator that it's really hard to do on your small design systems team. That would be one thing, is just the problem of building high quality generalizable stuff is not an easy problem. I think one of the other challenges is that we're generalizable. A lot of times when you're building something, there are use cases that people need that aren't clear at the time that you've started building it. So you have to like not just build in a way that generalizes to all of the known use cases today, but be really thoughtful, be really devil's advocate-y about trying to think through the things that you're not going to do today, but you might need to do in the future, so that you don't paint yourself into a corner, so that you don't like make irreversible decisions or hard to reverse decisions that get you to a point where it's easier to just start from scratch than to start from where you're at. Like a lot of one thing that I talk about a lot, and I think I tweeted a week or two ago, was that like the rhythm of product work is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that is the right way to iterate for product work, because you're working towards the leaf nodes. If you make a mistake, there's not stuff that's being built on top of that mistake. So reversing it, the cost of reversal is pretty inexpensive. Whereas the rhythm for systems work, not just design systems work, but anything horizontal, anything platformy in nature, is 1 step forward, 1 step forward, 1 step forward, where it's really important that the things that you do really well and you don't get them wrong, because the cost of reversing bad decisions is higher.
I love that.
I feel like we're walking in molasses.
Yeah.
Not in-
Oh, I forgot the spicy take. You asked me a question. I said I'm going to say the sort of stuff that we all believe first and then finish it with a spicy take. I think that the spicy take is a lot of people who work on systems stuff think that the work should be easier and less painful than working on product, because you're doing systems work, and if you get the system right, it like the end game is when you get the system, things become easier because you got the system. And I think that is true, but the reality of the situation is you don't benefit from the fact that you've made things easier. You just unlock yourself to be able to now work on harder problems. So I think that a lot of people in design systems work underestimate the fact that it is really hard, and it's supposed to be, because when you do good design systems work, you like unlock the privilege of working on even harder stuff. So that's like the spicy take is, I feel like it doesn't get easier, it shouldn't get easier, and people who like pretend that systems work should be like more predictable and easier and less painful than product work, if they're doing it at a high level, they'll be surprised how that really doesn't happen.
Sometimes I lay awake at night questioning if I named a prop the right term.
Yeah.
I don't know what word resonates. I'm making polls because that prop, if you change that name, that's suddenly a breaking change. And I don't want to be responsible for that next major. And there's so much pre-work that has to get done. And every decision is just another opportunity for doubt. They're not design systems, they're doubt systems, because they fill me with so much doubt.
It's funny. I was actually in that process like this week where I renamed the same prop 4 times, and I did it because I was like, okay, this makes sense. And I was thinking about it late night. I was like, wait, there has to be a better way of doing it, and I kind of renamed it again. I totally agree about it being more. You have to kind of also like, is there a consistent API throughout your whole system? Because like even for me, I didn't really understand it until like I use like other design systems that are like they're like very clear and concise. So I think was in a place where I was working on a product work, and I was like, oh wow, you could just like build components and not even think about like the prop names, because like you're the only one that's gonna be using it. And I was like, oh, this is like so liberating. But definitely when you're working on it, definitely gets it's hard work.
Yeah, totally true. And I think that like also can be approached as a systems problem. One thing that I didn't think of on my own, that when May joined Amplitude, she really sold me on, Jimmy, another engineer who I'm super privileged to work with, has sold me on too, is the importance of like code mods and using code mods to reduce the cost of breaking changes. So that if you can reduce the cost in a design system of making breaking changes through a tool like code mods, then you can also reduce some of the fear around making breaking changes and the sort of like fear of getting decisions a little bit wrong. It doesn't excuse you from not making good decisions, but I think anyone who's worked on anything large knows you're not going to get anything, you're not going to get everything. So like the two things you always want to constantly be thinking about is how can I get more of the things right, and then how can I reduce the cost of the things that I inevitably get wrong. And I think that in upcoming design systems, we'll see code mod driven breaking changes or code mods released alongside breaking changes as a thing that helps teams stay up to date without having to go back and do a lot of rework.
Yeah, I love that. For me, code mods make it a lot easier when you're changing like design token names, because that is probably one of the most requested. Hey, can we change this token name? I'm like, can we? And I love the ability to just run something through a CLI and have everything update for you automatically. It's almost
100%, yeah.
suspiciously magical. Like, I'm like, did it actually do what I think it just did? And it's just seeing all like the green, all the tests passing, beautiful. Like, I almost want to cry sometimes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so this up, but Jack, I'm wondering if you tell folks where they can find you, if Amplitude is hiring, or if you want to just plug something. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, you could find me in San Francisco, usually. Maybe an easier way to find me would be on Twitter. Jack McCloy, 2 C's and an L is how you spell my last name. And I am always easy to reach there. DMs are open. Happy to have a chat anytime. And yeah, Amplitude is always hiring. I think that I don't have any recs up for my team right now, but we're focusing on some really big design systems problems around sort of new UI work and improving some of the UX in parts of our product. And we're focusing on some really interesting systems problems right now as well around improving code quality, around build tooling, and kind of making the developer experience for the product teams that are working on Amplitude faster, and testing and creating bridges between Storybook and Figma, and a lot of fun stuff on our roadmap and in our pipeline. So if that seems like the types of problems that you like to work on, definitely drop me a line.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Yeah, Jack, thanks for I've learned so much, and you have a lot of quotes that I'm gonna copy and send to folks. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Before we wrap, I just want to say that I think I reached out to both of you separately over a year ago because I saw some of the work that you were doing and some of the things that you had been working on, and it was just really impressed. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on here and talk about myself and some of the things that I've been working on. But this all started because you two are like two people who are doing really incredible work in the space, and a lot of people look up to you, rightly.
Oh wow, that kind of made me want to cry a little bit, but
Yeah, I'm getting choked up here.
but cool. See you around.
Yeah, thanks, Jack.
Absolutely. Bye.